Hello, I am Deirdre English, and I am coming to you on behalf of the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. I'm so happy to be welcoming my fellow lecturer at the J School, Adam Hochschild, who's going to be talking in a few minutes about his. We're helping him to launch his brand new book, and this was going to be an event that we were going to have at the journalism school and with an audience, but because of the coronavirus crisis, we're doing it by Zoom. And so we're welcoming everybody out there who is going to see this at whatever time you do tune in. But this is a brand new, fresh book, Rebel Cinderella. The subtitle is From Rags to Riches to Radical, the epic journey of Rose Pastor Stokes. And Adam, in addition to being a professor at the J School, is a best-selling author of, I think, about 9 books, including the extremely well-known book King Leopold's Ghost, which is about colonialism, heroism, and slavery in the Belgian Congo, and To End All Wars, a book about World War I, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And his last book, which I've just been looking at again recently, another really wonderful book, Spain in Our Hearts, about the Spanish Civil War, but many other wonderful books as well. So this book, Rebel Cinderella, is set in a time that has some reverberations with our own time, which we will talk about at the end of Adam's presentation. So welcome, Adam. So happy to see you.
Well, thank you, Deirdre.
I think you are getting ready to launch your slideshow.
I am. All right. Here we are.
Shared, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Deirdre. It's a pleasure to be talking to people who are friends and supporters of the journalism school. And it's a pleasure to be with you, Deirdre. Deirdre and I have both been colleagues at the J School for many years and in what we call the real world before then. We both worked at Mother Jones magazine. And I'm glad to have the chance to talk to you about my new book. The book is basically the story of the woman in this picture, Rose Pastor Stokes, a remarkable figure who is largely forgotten today, but whose life story I found absolutely fascinating. The book is also about her very unusual marriage which is a window, I hope, onto life in this country a little more than a century ago. Let me trace her story first. The woman who became Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia in the town of Augustov in 1879. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustov, or at least some of them, did not live in a separate shtetl because Rose's father, from whom her mother separated soon after her birth, a cobbler, lived above his shop on this central square of the town. When Rose was born, the Russian Empire was then under the rule of Tsar Alexander II. He was, you'll remember, the reformer Tsar, the Tsar who freed the serfs. He also eased a few of the severe restrictions on Russia's Jews. He was no believer in full human rights, but he was considerably less anti-Semitic than others in the Romanov dynasty. However, the lives of Rose and millions of others were upended by something that happened 2 years after her birth, hundreds of miles away in St. Petersburg, the Russian capital. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And as soon as he was dead, his successor imposed harsh new restrictions on Russian Jews. And with encouragement from the top, there were a series of pogroms over the next 25 years. Hundreds of people were killed. Often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this was what spurred the great exodus of millions of Jews from the Russian Empire, first to Western Europe, and then for most of them on to the United States. And among them was Rose, 3 years old when she left Russia, and her divorced mother. They stayed first for 7 years in London, living in extreme poverty in the city's East End. And there, Rose had the only formal schooling she ever had, less than 2 years. But it was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write in English and to discover a great love for English poetry. When she was 11 years old in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States, like so many millions of people on packed immigrant ships like this one. They went immediately to Cleveland, Ohio. And within days after she arrived there, Rose, at the age of 11, had to immediately go to work in a factory making cigars. This is the first photograph in which she appears, taken in 1896. Rose is third from the left in the back row, right in the middle there, the middle of the back row in this picture, 16 years old. She was a cigar factory worker for a dozen years. By the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who'd been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. She worked evenings sometimes as well as days. She earned $8 a week, equal to about $240 a week today, to support a family of 8. Rolling cigars was hard work. Tobacco oil seeped into your clothes, your skin. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. The air in cigar factories was kept humid. The windows were nailed shut in summer in order that the tobacco leaves would not dry out. And very fine tobacco dust filled the air and workers' lungs. Cigar workers had the second highest rate of tuberculosis in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. Rose would have lung problems for as long as she lived. When she was 21 years old, something happened that changed her life. She saw a copy of a New York Yiddish newspaper, the Yiddisches Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. The paper ran one page in English every issue, and it invited contributions from readers around the country. So Rose began sending in poetry, anecdotes, dribs and drabs of news from Cleveland, where she was living. And the paper soon gave her a column, an advice column, which she wrote under the title Just Between Ourselves, Girls, under the pen name of Zelda. And she was amazed when one day she received a check for $2 in the mail, learning for the first time that you could actually be paid for writing. She was even more amazed when, after 2 years of doing this, the newspaper invited her to come to New York to write for the English page from the newspaper's headquarters at double the salary she was earning as a cigar worker. She arrived in New York in 1903, 23 years old. And imagine how amazing the city looked then to somebody who was seeing it for the first time. There were skyscrapers like none she had ever seen before, steam trains like this one running along above the street, elevated railways, trolleys on the street itself pulled by cables underneath the street, an enormous subway network being built, not quite yet open, and even on the streets a few of the new extraordinary horseless carriages. New York at that time was a city that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. More than half the men over 21 in Manhattan, for example, were foreign born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world. It was already the largest Jewish city in the world. This is what the Lower East Side looked like, where Rose lived and worked. It was people like these peddlers whom she interviewed and wrote about in the newspaper. One day in the summer of 1903, 6 months after she'd arrived in the city, her editor gave her a different assignment. It was to go and interview someone who worked at a settlement house on the Lower East Side. Now, you probably know something about settlement houses. These were set up throughout the big cities of the United States at this time to provide services in poor neighborhoods. They had childhood nutrition programs. They provided baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults as well, because these were things that didn't exist in the kind of packed tenements in which most people in New York City lived. They provided adult education classes, literacy classes. Now, the settlement houses in New York and other cities served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor. But the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. This is the settlement house on the Lower East Side called the University Settlement, where Rose was sent to do her interview. And this is the man she was asked to interview, a volunteer worker there, James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. He was Anglo-Saxon Protestant, as you can tell from the name, and he and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham Stokes came from the most different kind of background imaginable. Here, for example, is his parents' summer home, one of several homes in which he grew up. At the time that it was built, in the 1890s in the Berkshire Mountains of Western Massachusetts, it was the largest private home in the United States, 100 rooms. Legend has it that a brother of Graham Stokes, a student at Yale in the class of 1896, sent a telegram to his mother saying that he was bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and his mother replied, "Many guests already here, have room only for 50. While not at their summer home, Graham's parents lived in New York City in this mansion at Madison Avenue and 37th Street. Today, it's part of the Morgan Library. Here are Graham Stokes' parents. Each of them came from large fortunes, which they combined. Their money came in part from the Phelps Dodge mining empire, from real estate in New York City, especially luxury apartment buildings on the Upper East Side, and from a cluster of silver and gold mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them, and from more investments as well. Graham's parents had 9 children, and they and some of their spouses and offspring are in this picture. The boys in the family were expected to play prominent roles in the world, and they did. One became a famous architect, one became an editorial writer for the New York Times, one became what today would be called provost at Yale University. A grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls in the family were not expected to have careers, but to marry well, and they did. One married a nobleman and became a baroness. Another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. Graham Stokes, however, took a quite different route in life than his brothers and sisters. After graduating from Yale, he went to medical school at Columbia, and then, while working on a horse-drawn ambulance in New York City as a medical student, was exposed to a very different New York than the one that he'd grown up in. This was the New York of the tenements, and he was shocked by what he saw. Immigrants often living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room. People living in tenements where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. And of course, New York's tenements famously doubled as factories, makeshift sweatshops for the garment industry. Graham was outraged by what he saw, and that was what led him to the settlement house movement. And he actually went to live in a settlement house, the one that we saw a picture of on the Lower East Side, where Rose met him for the first time. The two of them courted secretly for 2 years, and then finally, word of their engagement got out, and the world learned of it, and it became immense. It was a subject of immense attention all over the world, reported in the United States and Europe and Australia. This is the page 1 headline from the New York Times. Here, their marriage is the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, what attracted attention was not just that this was a marriage of someone extremely rich and someone extremely poor, but of Jew and Gentile, something very unusual at at that time. So there was both a class and ethnic difference. And that's exactly what makes people fascinated with such marriages today, like that, for example, of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. That same newspaper immediately signed Rose up to write a series of articles, calling her the genius of the ghetto. And finally, despite the well-concealed opposition of Graham's family, they were married on July 18th, 1905, Rose's 26th birthday. Graham was 7 years old. The press remained fascinated by them, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. I think the core of the public's fascination was that here there seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming rescued poor, virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and brought her to live in his castle. And this is a myth that I think continues to fascinate us today. The idea that love will conquer all differences between a couple, no matter what the backgrounds are that they come from. And the public continued to watch them. What sort of transformation would this couple undergo? Here's a picture of Rose soon after they married. However, their lives did not fit the Cinderella script. For Graham, to some degree, had left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one. Although they often stayed at one or another of the houses of his parents, it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived as Graham's family did, others were desperately poor, and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best answer to such problems, the Socialist Party. Its leader at that time was Eugene V. Debs, noble, much beloved man, 5 times a candidate for president. He had begun as leader of the Railway Workers Union, and when he campaigned for president in 1908, 2 years after they joined the party, it was in a special train, the Red Special, with red flags and red bunting flying. And engineers of passing locomotives were thrilled when they saw the Red Special going along the track and always greeted him with long whistle blasts. Graham Stokes ran for office that same year and was on the platform with Debs when the Red Special came to New York. Graham was running as a socialist candidate for the New York State Legislature from the Lower East Side. Rose campaigned for him. Neither Graham nor Debs won, but people still remained fascinated by this couple. Everyone saw this as the Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired 2 novels. Here's one. And this novel was turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost, but we still have promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. And in a photo like this, we can only try to imagine what they are saying to each other. Now, despite these Cinderella fantasies, this was a time when millions of Americans, even those not living in great poverty, were becoming aware of the injustices in this country. One episode that dramatized the terrible labor conditions of the day involved clothing workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York, just off Washington Square. A terrible fire broke out. The workers on the upper floor of the building were trapped. Most of them were unable to get out. There was an inadequate fire escape that collapsed under the weight of people on it, and the door to a stairwell through which the workers could have escaped was locked to keep out union organizers. 146 people burned to death or leapt out the window to their deaths. Of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. 120,000 people marched in a mourning procession through New York's streets, and more than 300,000 people lined the streets. This was one of several events like this that made millions of people across the country aware of its great injustices. As Rose continued her journalism, issues of labor and social justice were now what she was mostly writing about, and also about women's rights. She got involved in one case that had echoes of the kind of battles still going on in the Me Too era today. A case that drew her attention was that of a woman named Sarah Coton. Coton worked as a nurse for a doctor in New York City whose home and office were in the same building. And she lived in a room that he gave her there, where one night he piped chloroform under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. Some weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. She got a gun. She shot and killed the doctor and surrendered to the police. Rose immediately went to the prison where she was being held, interviewed her in Yiddish, and to Rose, Sarah Coton told her story at much greater length than she had to anyone else. Rose announced that she would pay Sarah Coton's legal expenses, and once she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to stay. Coton's trial was delayed until she gave birth, and she was finally found innocent, in part because another woman, assaulted by the same doctor, came forward with a similar story. Starting a few years after Rose and Graham married, for a decade or more, the United States was convulsed by strikes. Hundreds of thousands of workers walked out every year. And this was a time when labor unions had almost none of the rights they later acquired. Strikes were often suppressed by police. These are Chicago police arresting a striking worker in Chicago. Sometimes by troops. These are striking clothing workers in Massachusetts, facing down the state militia. One big strike was of garment workers in New York City. If you look at these signs in this picture, you can see they are in English, Russian, Italian, and Yiddish. Rose was heavily involved in this one, speaking to groups of strikers, often many times each day. It was really in that garment workers' strike, begun in 1909, that she came into her own as an organizer and became an immensely popular speaker. She was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time, and she soon eclipsed her husband, and gradually the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories were more about her than about them as a couple. And there are signs that he was not entirely happy about this. The most colorful strike Rose got involved in was one of hotel and restaurant workers in New York in 1912. It was organized by the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the country's most militant union. Wobbly organizers walked into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another, usually just as lunch or dinner was about to be served. Blew a whistle, and the waiters walked out. They started with the Waldorf Astoria, Delmonico's, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, and other restaurants of lesser renown. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking workers. She handled publicity for the strikers, and she helped publicize the miserable conditions in which many of them worked. And in her papers, there are many, many letters of thanks from waiters who took part in this strike. One of the hotels struck was New York's largest, the Ansonia Hotel on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Street, still there as an apartment building today. Here is one of its several dining rooms. The Ansonia was a famous gathering place for musicians, show business people, and mobsters. Its owner was Graham Stokes' uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much else. And he was absolutely furious that his own nephew's wife was encouraging his workers to walk out. He will later come back into the story, you'll see. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose's and Graham's lives. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew and worked with some of the most interesting people in the United States of that era. Here are some of them. That's Rose with Eugene Debs on the left, and behind them, Max Eastman, the editor of The Masses, the best magazine in the country of that time, something of a precursor to the New Yorker. Another family friend was the wealthy heiress Mabel Dodge, who ran a famous salon in her Greenwich Village home, where the great questions of the day were debated. Occasionally, she asked Graham Stokes to moderate one of these debates. Also in their circle, Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the IWW, a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, a charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when necessary, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. Another friend was John Reed, probably the finest journalist of his generation. They also knew Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest Black intellectual of his time. Another friend and sometime house guest was Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the labor organizer. Rose and Graham knew all these people. Upton Sinclair, to whose novel, The Jungle, we owe our food and drug laws. As he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham Stokes for his comments. Margaret Sanger, the woman in the middle in this picture, the birth control pioneer. We take access to birth control for granted today, but this Brooklyn clinic where Sanger appears was shut down by the police shortly after she opened it, and Sanger went to jail. Rose was active in the campaign for birth control when talking about such things publicly was against the law. Another friend, often in jail, was Emma Goldman, the anarchist firebrand. Here's a mugshot taken during one of her many arrests. So all of these folks, Rose and Graham knew, they worked with, many were their house guests, some of us left us their recollections of the couple. Goldman, for instance, who was always very blunt, thought Graham was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose put up with it. The period of American life when all these people were active was a remarkable time, a time when all of them and millions of others believed the world that could be changed and that a new and much more just society could be brought into being. Sadly, though, something came that brought that period of great hope and optimism to an end: the First World War. It not only shattered innumerable lives, killing more than 9 million soldiers and untold millions of civilians, it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never fight each other. America, however, did not join the war when it started. American socialists and other radicals agitated strongly for the U.S. to stay out of the war. Rose, Emma Goldman, and many others, friends, joined something called the Women's Peace Party. But finally, in the spring of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. American troops began going to France, soon in huge numbers. By mid-1918, they were heavily involved in the most fierce fighting. Here at home, the country was swept by war fever and ferocious government propaganda, like this enlistment poster for the U.S. Army. There was tremendous paranoia about spies, and that paranoia was directed against anti-war radicals. I don't know if you can read the caption at the top of this cartoon. It says, "Now for a roundup." Many radicals still felt very strongly that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed or arrested when they spoke. The war created a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the United States to join the conflict. Graham was so enthusiastic about the war that he enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but for several years he served in the New York National Guard. But he never came closer to combat than marching in parades like this one in 1918, going down Fifth Avenue. Something else divided Rose and Graham that happened in late 1917. The second stage of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks seized power. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. Rose continued speaking out against the war, and now in favor of the Russian Revolution. And this drew the ire of many people, including Graham's uncle, the angry hotel owner, Uncle Will. Remember him? Here's a report about him from the files of the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI. And it reads, agent received word from W.E.D. Stokes that Rose Pastor Stokes at various times in her residence at 88 Grove Street, New York City, held meetings with socialists and IWW, and if a search was made of the premises, some valuable information could be secured. A few days later, he called the Bureau, told them that Rose and Graham would be out of town and that that would be a good occasion to search the house. The Bureau kept a close eye on Rose. Agents followed her, stenographers transcribed her speeches, and after one anti-war talk, she was arrested. In the summer of 1918, she was put on trial, found guilty, sentenced to 10 years in prison. Graham Stokes put up bail money. They appealed the case, and the sentence was eventually overturned on appeal, so she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, their marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going radically different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party, and in 1922, she went to Russia as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. Like far too many people, she thought that there she had found paradise. Graham searched for paradise in a different direction. He abandoned all of his interest in progressive politics, became interested in religion, particularly in blending the traditions of Hinduism and Christianity. In 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and this put them back on the front pages for the last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press lost interest in them. But happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary, and they wrote dueling, unpublished memoirs. Rose's was finally published about 50 years after her death. So there was rich, rich material to work from and to try to reconstruct their relationship and the ringside seat they had to a remarkable period of American history. So do historians a favor and save your letters and keep diaries. After the divorce, Rose, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony. She was reduced to poverty again. She remarried, but to someone as poor as she. And soon after that came down with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. Graham also remarried, but not taking a leap out of his class this time. He married the daughter of a railroad executive. And he lived on to the age of 88, dying in 1960. So that's their story. I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but perhaps through their eyes, we can see a world that needed changing and still does today.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that illuminating slideshow and presentation. And let's talk some more about your book. You know, I know that you have a real interest in trying to find characters in history who allow you to tell often a human rights story. Is that what drove you in the case of this book as well?
Well, yes, I'm always fascinated by people who tried to change the world. Those are the folks I most like to write about. So the milieu in which Rose and Graham Stokes lived was filled with such people. Emma Goldman, Big Bill Hayward, Mother Jones, all of those folks at a very exciting time in American history. But I was also fascinated by this marriage. Two people from such incredibly different backgrounds, both ethnically and especially class-wise. And the amount of documentation they left behind in the way of diary, letters, things that other people observed about them gives you the ability to sort of reconstruct somebody else's marriage, which you usually don't have, especially with a relationship that far in the past. So that certainly fascinated me too.
You know, one of the things that fascinated me in reading your book and thinking about these two people was the feeling that both Rose and Graham were individuals who were driven very much by matters of principle. They both had, very, very strong ideas about the way things should be, and kind of moral principles. So when they agreed, when their moral principles agreed, they did very well together.
That's true. And, the first years of their marriage, they were sort of the golden couple of the American left, uh, who were celebrated not just by their fellow socialists, who were delighted to have this celebrity couple in their midst, but also treated very sympathetically by all kinds of, middle of the road and middle class audiences that they lectured to, because of the Cinderella nature of the romance. And during those first years of their marriage, they seemed to be in great harmony, both personally and politically.
Well, we'll come in a few minutes. Let's come to what happened when they began to disagree with each other and when their marriage began to go on the rocks. But I want to start a little bit back, a little big, broader frame of the period of time. And I know you're fascinated by this period of time. And don't you think it has some real resonance with our period?
I do, because it was a time when people were becoming acutely conscious of the enormous disparities of wealth in the United States. During the era of the robber barons, the late 19th century and the first few years of the 20th, there had been vast accumulations of wealth at the top in this country. And it was a time when there was horrible poverty at the bottom. Not just these immigrants, that we saw the photos of the conditions that they lived in and worked in, but, Black people in the South who had really been betrayed by, the failure of Reconstruction, uh, people living in horrible conditions elsewhere in the country. And we are in a similar period of disparities of wealth today. Obviously, conditions at the bottom are not as bad as they were, 120 years ago, but the proportion of income and of wealth that the top 1% of the United States has today is higher than the proportion that the top 1% had in 1905 when Rose and Graham got married.
So both Rose and Graham were caught up in the socialist movement at that time. And can you tell us a little bit more about Rose's relationship with Eugene Debs, and maybe even throw in a little bit of some reflections on Bernie Sanders today, sort of looking for these resonances. And I know that Bernie said that Eugene Debs was his great hero. So start with telling us a little bit about Rose's relationship with Debs, and then let's talk a little bit more about the Debs Bernie comparison.
Well, Eugene Debs was an eloquent and noble, generous man who was longtime leader of the Socialist Party, as he had been of the Railroad Workers Union before that. He ran for president 5 times. Uh, he went to jail for his convictions, speaking out against the First World War. He was imprisoned for more than 2 years. The last time he ran for president was in 1920, when he was still in prison for his anti-war convictions, and he received nearly 1 million votes. Some months after that, he was finally pardoned after 2.5 years in prison by President Warren Harding. And Harding actually generously invited Debs to stop in at the White House on his way home. And Debs said, I've run for the White House 5 times, but this is the first time I've ever actually gotten here. Rose was close friends with Debs, and she was actually literally at his side, holding his hand in the courtroom where he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He trusted her, and she was one of the very few people, other than his own brother, in whom he confided about a romance that he had. There was a woman he was very much in love with, who was not his wife, and he wanted Rose to be something of an intermediary between the two of them when he was in prison. Comparing Debs to Bernie Sanders, I don't know. I think that Debs was probably a better campaigner. He certainly had the ability at that time to inspire immense adoration. But you can argue that Bernie Sanders got a larger portion of the vote, at least in terms of the popular vote in 2016 when he ran for president. And I'm glad Bernie has Debs as his hero.
Yeah, he definitely feels that he was continuing the legacy of Debs in many ways. So maybe change does happen, but just not on the pace that we'd like to see.
I mean, I
Why?
think we do have to give the early socialists credit for all kinds of things. There are a lot of things we take for granted today, like Medicare, Social Security, unemployment insurance, which is a huge thing right at this moment that we're speaking. These were ideas that socialists first put on the table 100, 120 years ago. And we wouldn't have them if they hadn't put those ideas out there.
Could you clarify something that you did mention in your slideshow, which is exactly why Rose was threatened with prison or was arrested, and then I know that her husband bailed her out. But what exactly did she do?
Well, when the United States entered the First World War in the spring of 1917, soon after that, there was passed something called the Espionage Act, an amended version of which is still in effect today. And it was very strict, and it provided, especially when strengthened the next year by something called the Sedition Act, it provided prison sentences for anybody who, it was sweepingly vague language, whose statements could be judged to cast criticism upon the aims of the United States, things like that. Some 2,000 people were sent to prison under the Espionage Act. Additional numbers of people, and nobody that I've been able to find has actually counted them all, were also sent to prison under state laws that mimicked these national restrictions on free speech. Rose spoke against the war. Debs spoke against the war. Rose was sentenced to 10 years, and this was one of the things that inspired Debs to speak out. And in although Rose's case was eventually overturned on appeal, Debs's was not. In the speech that sent him to jail, Debs quoted Rose and said, "If Rose Pastor Stokes is guilty of violating the Espionage Act, so am I."
So it seems really strange that she did not go to prison and he did.
Yeah, I think the appeals court found fault with the instructions that the judge had given to the jury, but they took several years to make that decision. And by this point, the war was long over. And the attorney general at the time asked President Woodrow Wilson, should we bring this case again? Because they basically, the appeals court said, you want to send her to jail, you got to bring the case all over again. And Woodrow Wilson said, well, I think she's a terrible influence on the country, but I think the time for that is past. So they did not bring the case again, probably in part because they feared that she was so articulate and had been so popular that they didn't want a martyr figure like that.
Yeah, although of course Debs was also articulate and popular
Yeah.
too, but perhaps making a martyr out of a woman would have been looked at differently.
Exactly. Yeah.
So one thing that strikes me, this comes back also to why the marriage foundered, that Rose and Graham disagreed about World War I very strongly and on principle. Each one had an extremely strong principle that they were defending. Could you just say what the principle was to each of these individuals?
Well, Rose was very much an internationalist, a socialist, and she believed, as did many socialists at that time, that the working classes of the world ought to unite and fight the capitalists and not each other. So she, like most people on the left in the United States, were appalled by the outbreak of the war in Europe and just felt this was not their battle. Most of them, including Rose, said they didn't like the militaristic nature of Germany, but they still felt that this was a cause not worth dying for. Graham was very much in favor of the Allies in this war. He saw, France and Belgium as being victims of a German attack, which indeed they were. But I think it was also, there were some psychological sources for his feeling too. In high school and college, he had been a cadet, military cadet. He had actually served in the army, in the cavalry during the Spanish-American War. He was not sent overseas, but he spent a year in cavalry. He always had an affection for military life. And after he joined the National Guard in 1917, he remained in it for years to come, in it full time for the next couple of years. And then, drilling after that, he got promoted to major eventually. And when you go through his business correspondence and so on after they divorced, his secretary refers to him as Major Stokes when she's writing to people, even when it's not having to do with National Guard business. And I think that for many men who are adrift in life, and in this case, it was a man who was also being outshone by his wife, there's something comforting about the military. They tell you what to do. You get to wear a snazzy looking uniform. You're respected by people on the street. There are no decisions to make because they make the decisions for you. Military life does have its appeals.
So you've written a whole book about World War One, and so with the benefit of hindsight, granted, and looking back, would you say that Rose was more right than wrong in the principles that she upheld in her dispute with Graham over World War One?
Definitely. World War One was a war that never should have been fought. It was not worth all those deaths. Because look what came out of it. The war ended not just with 9 million soldiers and an untold and probably larger number of civilians killed, but it left behind a reservoir of bitterness and resentment, without which it's impossible to imagine World War II happening, and I think impossible to imagine the Holocaust happening.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the rights and wrongs of how it started, and certainly Germany was in the wrong for launching the attack, I think the consequences of the war were so catastrophic that it's always made me respect the people who opposed it at the time and were somehow wise enough to see that this war was going to remake the world for the worse in every way. So I think Rose was right about that.
Well, let's move on then to the Russian Revolution. So this was another, major world-shaking event that divided people, and it divided Rose and Graham, who their marriage had stayed together, after the Debs trial and after her own, trial, and he supported her, but the Russian Revolution shook their marriage again.
It did, and I'm afraid she was as wrong about the Russian Revolution as she was right about the First World War, because we all know what a horror show the Soviet Union turned into. And some other radicals at the time, many unfortunately also had Rose's illusions at that time, but some did not. Eugene Debs, although he had great hopes for the Russian Revolution, he fairly soon began to see some of the problems there, and he refers in his letters to the Vatican in Moscow making decisions that they had no right to make. Rose's friend Emma Goldman actually was exiled to Russia, kicked out of the United States in 1917, spent 2 years in Russia, where she arrived full of hope, and she left there 2 years later deeply disillusioned. Never lost her radicalism, never lost her desire to remake the world for the better, but she saw that that was not happening in the Soviet Union and saw it clearly.
And what about Graham? What did he make of the Russian Revolution, and what principles were at stake in his mind?
Well, he thought it was terrible, but he actually, I wish I could say it was out of a deep commitment to democracy. I don't think so. I think it was just out of a a feeling that here were these unwashed revolutionaries, lower class, uncultured types who were taking over. And he actually urged the United States to back Admiral Kolchak, who was one of the white Russians who was fighting to suppress the Bolshevik revolution. But Kolchak was a terrible guy, a raving anti-Semite, would have been a military dictator, would have been a right-wing military dictator had he taken over Russia.
So Graham was right, more right than Rose was about the Russian Revolution, but doesn't deserve as much credit as Rose did in the case of World War I. Would you?
Right, right.
Maybe we can say that. So anyway, their marriage then had suffered these, incredible stresses and rifts on principal matters of, world importance, and they'd been in the thick of it in both cases in different ways. Yet it lasted through a lot of that. And then what was the final straw that caused them to split from each other?
Well, I think it was something that was building for a long time, and it was building, uh, I think, in large part for reasons that did not have so much to do with politics. When they married, Graham was 7 years older than Rose. He had multiple graduate degrees. She'd had only 2 years of schooling, although she was a reader. She was very much in awe of his erudition, in awe of the well-known writers and artists that he knew and so forth. And she kind of looked to him for her political opinions. And it took her about 10 years to get over that, to realize that she was smarter than he was. And it took her less time than that to realize that she was far more popular as a speaker, and that he was, as Emma Goldman thought, something of a stuffed shirt. He was certainly somebody who, whatever he espoused in the way of socialism for the first 10 years or so of their marriage, didn't like the idea of his wife getting a lot more attention than he did. I think he still had a quite traditional idea of marriage where, the man was in charge. And I think she had that too when she went into it and then outgrew it. And he never did. So that source of strain was there from like 5 or 6 years into the marriage onward. I think they stayed together. They had different reasons for staying together. They both had a horror of divorce. Graham, because virtually nobody in his family had ever been divorced, and he felt he came from this long line of immensely respectable people who'd all made good marriages and made fortunes, and it was just would have been a shockingly disgraceful thing to get divorced. Rose had had the experience of seeing her birth father abandon her mother, and then her stepfather abandon her mother. So she also valued the idea of an intact family very much. And I think it was sort of the momentum from those feelings that kept them together for a long time, when certainly for the last 8 or 9 years of their marriage, there was a lot of stress and strain between them. And during that time, Rose spent quite a bit of time apart from Graham. Her best friend was a novelist, Olive Tilford Dargan, who lived in North Carolina, and she would go off and spend several months at a time with Dargan.
After they divorced, Adam, do you think that either of them found happiness?
They seem to have. These marriages, we don't have such a view of the inside of. But Graham remarried to the daughter of a railroad executive. She was much younger than he was, and they remained together apparently happily until his death more than 30 years later. Rose had a passionate love affair with a guy who left her for a younger woman, and her heart was broken, but soon mended. She fell in love with somebody else, a man, interesting, also some years younger than she, and remained with him apparently happily until her death. But that came only about 6 or 7 years later, and she was ill with cancer for most of that time.
But he was a fellow radical.
He was a fellow radical, also a Jewish immigrant from Europe, also a communist.
I suppose you could say that they each reverted to type,
They did, in a way they did. In a way they did.
But another way to look at it is that Rose remained consistently who she was politically throughout her entire life. Her principles remained intact from beginning to end, whether they got her in trouble or not. Whereas somehow it seems that Graham adopted his socialist principles for a period of time during his early marriage with Rose, but then by the end of his life had abandoned those principles.
I think that's right. I think that's right. She was more consistent in a way. There's something else I admire about Rose too, which was that she was extremely good at understanding and relating to all kinds of people. She was very good at relating to Graham's family, even though they had very different values than she did. But she found the one member of the family, a sister of Graham's, Helen, whom she became very close to, who shared her political values, and she remained close friends with Helen Stokes after she and Graham divorced. She had the ability to talk to any kind of audience. When she spoke to workers, she talked about her time in the cigar factory and what she'd learned there from bitter experience about speed up, for example. When she talked to middle-class women, women's clubs, did a lot of that kind of lecturing. She would talk about things like the Triangle Fire to, etch the nation's injustices on their consciences. When she spoke to a religious audience, she would talk about the issues she cared about in terms of Bible stories. She really knew how to relate to a wide range of people, and there is an extraordinary range of people, from whom letters to her survive among her papers. It was just fascinating going through those.
Mm. Well, I think that you have done a beautiful job in this book, which I cannot recommend too highly. I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be a tremendous success, despite the fact that it's unfortunate that it has had to be launched at the time of the coronavirus crisis. And I know your book tour was upended by that. I still think, though, that this book is going to find its audience because you've done an amazingly beautiful job of rendering this woman, and with all of her passion, her warmth, her principles, her fiery capabilities as an orator, and you've given us, somebody to add to the pantheon of fascinating and really great women in history, and someone of enormous charisma. So thank you so much, Adam, for having written this book. And I know it took a great deal of research, but you love research, don't you?
I do. And thank you for those kind words, Deirdre. I much appreciate it.
Well, yeah, we're really grateful. And we hope that we can do anything we can to help this book on its way and to great success. So you have been listening to Adam Hochschild, the author of Rebel Cinderella, From Rags to Riches to Radical, The Epic Journey of Rose Pastor Stokes. Hopefully you can support an independent bookstore and buy it. And this has been a production of the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley. Thank you.